Hello, hello. Hey y'all, Hoot here now in a new format. It is the 29th of July as of recording. It is very sunny and beautiful outside, and this is episode 1 of Hootcast or HelvetiiCast. I'll be honest, I haven't really thought of a name for this quite yet. Anyway, the reason I am doing things like this starting this month, at least for the foreseeable future, is the first simple reason is, believe it or not, we are actually approaching the end of development for Helvetii. There are still quite a few things to do and assemble and test, of course. We're not quite out of the woods yet, but this mostly means that there isn't that much more new things to show and updates, since a lot of it has already been shown or drawn out. The mechanics are now finalized and implemented more or less at this point. So it's mostly just us adding things and testing all of them pretty much. And since I don't have many creative ways of repeating myself, I thought this would be a little bit more interesting for everyone. There's also a few things that we do want to keep as a surprise for release, so we're not gonna post everything on Kickstarter. With that said, of course I will still post gameplay sections and minor updates alongside those videos. That's not really going to change. The other reason is that I think part of what makes a Kickstarter fun is also to have a more direct relation with you all, with what in regards to behind the scenes and making ofs and whatnot, talking about our process and the troubles we encounter. And while I am not a documentarian, if that's the term, I thought having this way is also a pretty neat way of delivering it, and will let me talk about broader subjects not strictly related to, what did I do this month, or what new things we can show. It will also be a good occasion to have other people join me in later months, such as my colleagues, like Iron Bell, Julie, or any other person who has worked on the project, and their input on it, or their work on general, their own approaches. We can also take QAs from the community if you have any questions that I can answer directly in this matter. I'm also honestly more comfortable talking like this than doing write-ups. Lets me be a little bit more loose and elaborate on some things. In any case, I hope you will enjoy this. Pardon me for the scuff of this first episode. As some might gather from my accent, I am not a native English speaker, and I will do my best to not eat my own words too much. I have a tendency to do this. I'm doing actually my best to articulate as I'm recording this. I will also be playing some recent gameplay recordings, as we'll be testing the new summon system and just the gameplay loop in general. So I've been recording straight from Unity to make it easier to do it, but that also means you might notice a few hitches, bugs, and unfinished assets. You know the drill at this point, it's product night final, etc, etc. Speaking of which, I think it will also be a good opportunity for this first episode and doing all these tests to talk about basically our approach to game balancing, what were our inspirations and motivations to design the game in such a way. I think I've actually never really talked about this before in previous updates, at least not in details, so I think it would be a pretty interesting thing to talk about. I also want to talk a little bit more about our approach on visual design and specifically the mythology aspect, because I know I've received a few comments in the past on how we do our research, like what part of mythology we take. Some are a little bit more curious about that, so yeah, we'll be touching on that too in just a bit. But first and foremost, just a little bit on the state of the game first. So, I wanted to start quickly with this, since I know that's what most people want to hear about first, and some have been curious about release and beta, so let's talk about it. As said earlier, we're pretty much now hammering away at just cramming everything in, now that most of the assets are done, barring a few endgame things. The biggest things remaining at this point, aside from pure content, are the intro sequence, which I've shown a little bit, talked about in the previous updates, as well as everything related to the ending, like just really the final cinematics, the final encounters, and a few options like the hardened nightmare mode and like the minor options like key binding, all the quality of life things. Thankfully, since this is all things we are now very practiced in the most part, it will not take as long as our earlier levels, especially since most of the assets have been done quite a while ago, actually. It's still a few months away, but we really are seeing the end of the tunnel, so it's not going to be that long. But speaking of which, I estimate that we'll be hitting release probably around end of this coming winter, I want to say. Now, I know it's slightly later than expected, and believe me, I want it to be done as much as you all have been patiently waiting, and thanks a lot for that, especially since we are basically also rating on fumes, internally. But our biggest goal is to deliver something that's really polished and great to play, so we'll have to take the time needed to finish it properly, but thanks to everyone who understands that and has been sending some really nice messages too. It helps a lot to keep our spirits up while we work our way on just the last bits of the game. But with all that said, it's really not that far off. We're talking now in terms of just a few months, just barely extra, just to finish the game. On a more positive note, there's also the beta coming up, and my goal is to have this ready sometimes, probably more during this fall. So every backer who had the beta and their tiers as a reward will have access to it. This will be done most likely for Steam and using the Steam community forums. And what will be accessible will be pretty much all of the game up to end of level 3, with most of the summons, all the characters, the upgrade system, regular and probably hard mode as well. So it will be already quite meaty. There will be quite a few things to test out and to do. I hope everyone will be able to enjoy it and point out anything that they really like or would like to see tweaked. All in all, thanks everyone for your support. And speaking of tweaks, well, let's move on to the main subject. I don't think I've really talked about this before in depth, but it's about how we balance things out in Helvetii, especially considering it's both an action game or close to a character action game and a roguelite. I know quite a few people who backed our projects have also played quite a few roguelites and are aware are some of the things that tend to surface in this type of game. one of the prime motivators when we started designing the game is we wanted to make sure that whatever items or upgrades you get during a run, you won't feel like you're being too ineffective or limited when you start a new run. I don't know if it's the same thing for people listening, but a common thing, a common thing that I personally experienced in many other games of that genre is that after a while of playing them, you will always kind of gravitate towards the items or builds that give you the most options or the specific options you feel most comfortable with. But in return, starting them over does feel like you are limited in your moveset, so like you are missing something crucial, and not getting those same items later on, like if you get something else, will feel like, oh well, I would rather start over because it doesn't feel quite as fun. So with Helvetii, the logic was, well, what if you started with a pretty large set of skills from the beginning? Obviously, it's easier said than done, and we'll see how it pays off when more people get their hands on the game. But so far, internally, we had some really good comments, people appreciating just that they can go, as we say, they can go ham with any characters from the get-go and do some really, really cool stuff, regardless of what item they get. And it's just that feeling of, yeah, you don't feel like you're missing something from the very beginning. In general, we also like to have a buff rather than nerf approach. For those who are unfamiliar with the term, it just means that we tend to balance towards rather giving more power than taking it away. We do feel that part of the fun of a roguelite is also being able to kind of break the game if you get like some really good items during your run, so we don't really want to take that away from people. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule, such as if something you move is too dominant or completely breaks the system to a point where it can break the game and not in a fun way. Or also if it just feels too much like, oh, like this shouldn't happen, like if it feels broken or like a bug. But even then, we'll try to accommodate. We have had certain situations during testing where we switched some things around, so when people found something odd, we adapted it as part of the game later. It's also a very similar philosophy that I remember people from Platinum Games talking about when they'd rather offer more than not enough when it came to movesets. You can probably still find that GDC talk, because it was a GDC talk, probably on YouTube or somewhere else. A example we actually have is early on, characters could not air dash. Instead, it was an item you had to find in a chest. And the thought was, well, it feels kind of special to be able to do it, so special enough to be an item. So you had to find the item, and then once you got it, yeah, you could air dash. But very quickly, we had testers who, after getting said item, would then feel like they were missing that options if they didn't get it again in their next run, especially because it became too indispensable as part of the kit. Like you were missing a defensive option in the air. It was essentially like the only defensive tool you could get against projectiles and attacks. So after that, we just decided, well, we'll make it part of the base kit. And since then, yeah, the game felt much more fun after that, and Instead, now the item was converted to, well, you get a second air dash. So now the item doesn't feel indispensable, and instead it just, oh, it gives a little extra to your kit without feeling like it's necessary. In regards to balancing, there is also the question of complexity. And while we are making a combo-based action game with lots of moves and options, one thing we want from the start is to keep it pretty simple and straightforward so that anyone can really pick up the game and, test it out and find out what they can do organically. We're not Devil May Cry, as to take an example from another game. We're not on that same level of just doing insane thing with lots of different inputs and style switching. We pretty much want to be our own thing in this case. And while it's very tempting to go, oh, we could, add this move and this cool move, and not only is it like a lot of extra work in terms of animation, there's no guarantee that it would actually improve the experience for the user. There's always a danger that like a bunch of work that you do will either go unused by most of the player base or becomes redundant, or even just too unwieldy to use properly, and so it will get ignored by most people in favor of just, simpler options. An example of this we also have is for the extra moves for the characters that I've talked about a few months ago. To be quite honest with everyone here, it's like I've been racking my brain on them because not only do they feel kind of odd to use, like they require extra directional inputs during charge, they follow kind of a role that feels too similar to the attacks from the summons, which I feel are much more impactful, much more fun to use and easy to use, and I feel are more so thematically important to the rest of the game. And at the end of the day, those extra moves don't add that much. They start to feel so pretty redundant compared to those summon attacks. So you sometimes have to take decisions of, going back on designs, going back on work that has already been made. The saying, of less is more can often apply to a lot of these situations, especially considering you have a lot of other things that factor into your combat, like how the enemies are designed, how do they move, how do you interact with the level, and all the different items. So there is always this danger that you want to do too much and ends up, just being noise. But with all that said, I'm pretty happy where Helvetii stands right now in terms of game feel and combat complexity, I should say. You might see in the background, if I'm not doing too badly at this point in the video as I'm saying this, there's already quite a lot going on, even with simple inputs. You can do some really neat stuff. I've seen other testers do some really insane jump canceling, dash canceling with their moves. I hope when beta comes that people will also be able to discover a bunch of different things. Last thing I wanted to touch on for this episode, because I've gotten some interesting comments in the past on how does the game actually take from its mythology, either on Kickstarter or doing cons and meetups, so I thought it would be really nice to talk about it. Now, straight up, I'm no historian. Helvetii is not a historically accurate game either, so of course there will be some liberties taken here and there, sometimes for convenience, often because it also makes it more fun. Not that I don't take into account the history and mythology, of course, we'll talk about that just in a second, but just to be clear for people who expect a 100% historical accuracy or fidelity in game, where you can do a triple air slash with a fox twink wielding a sickle. But the idea was still to do something based around that time period and specific civilization, hence the name of Helvetii. The initial thought almost started as a joke between colleagues way back then. It was even before the start of a project, as a what would you do if you had to make a game about Switzerland type of discussion. But while Gaul and Helvetii are not Switzerland, and I insist on that point quite often because I didn't really want to make a game about that, but more on that specific tribe, I found it pretty interesting to look it up because there isn't much that we know, and like we don't even learn about it all that much here at school. We just kind of gloss over it because technically it's not part of Swiss history. Now, we do know, of course, about where or somewhat how they lived based on archaeological findings of houses and human remains. We found mounds and different villages and where they were located. Myself, I've been to a few of the dig sites and a few of museums also that talk about the subjects and the findings. It's how you learn, for example, that how the villages were built, what kind of money they used, and that most of it actually was from Greek origin for a while because of mercenary work, or what were their diets and who they fought, which was mostly themselves or traded with. But that's mostly for practical stuff. When it came to the, intricacies of their society and mostly their stories and their mythologies, it becomes quite more difficult. There isn't really anything written left behind by most of the tribes of that period. Like, their written language was not that much of a thing, and most of the accounts was written by Romans, particularly Julius Caesar's, who maybe not the most trustworthy source when you think about it. But with that said, when it came to designing like monsters and gods and making up a story, it kind of became both a fun but also kind of a tricky exercise of extrapolating and research based on leftover Celtic art and just a few historical facts that we had. Like, it's why I also based my period on just before the invasion of Gaul by the Romans, kind of like that era where could have kind of made some stories about. I personally have a book that's really helpful that I borrowed from an old teacher of mine. It is essentially called Mythologies of Pre-Roman Switzerland. It's not really recent. I believe it was published in 1963 in Geneva, so it's not the most up-to-date thing. But the subject matter is still really relevant because it basically relates on how mythologies around the world basically mirror each other. And it gave a specific view on really the pre-Roman period, which I thought was the most important thing. It essentially relates how a lot of those mythologies reflects what people did or needed at that time. That's why you have a quadrillion gods and guardians for water sources everywhere, because it turns out it really sucks if you don't have running water, and also lots of gods for fertility, war, crops, and so on. So with that information, when it comes to designing gods, you can base yourself, of course, on local symbols and what you would imagine would be, would call it the texture. Like, you'll base yourself on the geography. You'll mostly go around using iconographies from nature, from trees and stones, and just in general, um, quote unquote, brand of that civilization. But sometimes you would, like, if you were lacking information, you could, like, uh, take from the general utility people would assert to these gods. It's important to know so that most of Gallic culture back then, or Gallic gods, did not really have physical representation. Like, there's no real statues, as far as I know, like, as far as I've researched, they didn't really have pretty visuals for these gods. We had maybe a very, very few. We have a famous cauldron here with representation, I think, of Lug or Cernunnos in this instance. But in most cases, like in temples or just in general, like, there isn't anything. There's very, very little when it comes to actual appearances of gods. Most of it comes from more recent, like, neo-pagan interpretations, but there isn't, as you would say, a canon look. That's mostly all up to imagination, really. But it's also fun at this point where you can see how other people and other parts of the world will represent similar deities. Of course, over this you also have your own takes. I have my own resources and inspiration as an artist. I know I've received comments in the past that were like, "Oh, these kind of look like stands from JoJo Bizarre's Adventure, like an anime." And yeah, that's fair. Like, it's been obviously like a big inspiration. But with that said, it's also why I redesigned some of those things later on, because I try to be a little bit less self-indulgent. Like, I know it's fun to have fun with the things you like, but nobody likes it too when you're nerding out a little bit too hard and, like, into your own head. So I also wanted to have the representation of gods to be a little bit more honest. Like, what if these cultures really had a representation, and less about me geeking out on an anime that I like. There's also in the game references to other monsters and legends that are more anachronistic. They come from more recent legends, like the cultists from level 2 being inspired by the Chagata from Lochental, like the carnivals, for instance, which also have like a pretty mysterious origin. The Tasselwurm is an enemy that's from local Alpine legends. It's not very Gallic, so to speak. Other enemies are more just based on, just general monsters and sometimes poems that I've read about. And that's also kind of what was part of the fun of the project, is to take these separate pieces and kind of reinvent or restructure a new mythology, since there wasn't really anything in the first place. And to both have things that are inspired by research and history and all the different things you can gather from books and dig sites, and see how to transform them with a new language, language of a video game, specifically in arcadey 2D fighting games. I think that was kind of like part of the more interesting things to do with this project. Anyway, I think that's going to be it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed our very first try for this. If you have any questions or would like to know more, please feel free to comment either on the Kickstarter or Twitter. I will really read everything, and would be really interesting to have your thoughts on this, or just if you like this new format. And in the meantime, I will see you next month. Don't forget that you can also follow on Twitter at Helvetii Game. And also, I try to stream every week. I do at least one night where it's like game dev stuff. So you can go like on twitch.tv/Hoot_Petoots. That's my general channel. And yeah, give it a follow if you like. and I'll see you next month. Thank you very much for your time.